Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador. This is my review of Sony's FE 85mm F1.8 Portrait Prime. Now, this isn't a new lens. I've owned this lens for many years, but I thought it was about time that I paid due respect to one of my favorite lenses. For those of you who might leave the video tutorial early, I'll just cut to the chase and describe some of the key specifications here. It's got double linear AF motors for really fast AF. You could in fact use this lens to shoot sport, and I'll have examples later. It's got near silent AF, and it's got a rounded 9-blade diaphragm or aperture, and that means that if you stop the aperture down slightly, you're still going to get these nice round bokeh balls. You've got an AF/MF switch, you've got a focus hole button which you can reassign to any custom button. It's dust and moisture resistant, it's small, light and affordable. In fact, at $548 on B&H Photo, it is Sony's bargain basement prime lens. I think if you only ever own one prime lens, this would have to be it. It's also very light at just 371 grams or 13 ounces. So what's there not to like? Some people will be drawn to the wider f1.4 G Master lens now, but you can see the form factor of the f1.8 is one of the reasons that I still own this lens. I really like the smaller form factor when I'm going out on location with a small messenger bag, because it just simply takes up far less room in that messenger bag. So yes, I do love that 1.4 G Master, but I actually prefer the 1.8 for that form factor advantage there. The 85mm prime lens is often described by many people as being the portrait prime. The reason for this is that it puts you at exactly the right working distance to create these intimate head and shoulder portraits. If you're working at an event like I often do, such as a parade or demonstration, I won't have people walking between me and the subject because I'm close enough to the subject so people will walk around the back of me. But I'm not so close to the subject to make the subject feel uncomfortable because I'm invading their personal space. The advantage also is that when you're working with this focal length, you're not going to distort features, which may be the case if you're working too close with, say, a wide angle lens such as a 35mm. So that portrait prime is a name that describes why this lens is most suited to this type of work. Now, as you can see, that I will often get a little bit closer on the second and subsequent shot. That really draws you into the eyes, and the depth of field, even with the 1.8 aperture, is shallow enough to put the background well out of focus. We even have the ears going out of focus here and the tip of the nose going out of focus, and what this does is it draws you into the subject's eyes, so it becomes a very intimate way of creating these portraits of the subjects that you're wanting to photograph. Now, if I zoom in on post-production software, you'll see that this lens is pin sharp wide open. Now, it's not a G or GM or a Zeiss designed bit of glass, so this is really delivering for the price point. And I'll show you some more examples to show you how sharp this lens is. And in the info section below this video, you'll have a link to some ultra high definition images. So if you are not already watching this on a large 4K screen, I would recommend that you start doing that now. Let's take a look at this image that I captured in Japan, and as I zoom in and we look at the detail in those in that leading eye, we'll see that this is simply amazing for capturing rich detail with this 1.8 lens with the aperture wide open. Let's take a look at another portrait that I captured in Bali at a funeral ceremony that I was invited to document for the family. And as again we zoom into this young woman's eyes, we can quite clearly see how well defined the eyelashes on her eye actually are with this lens shooting wide open. Now, you might not always be shooting portraits of people. They might be shooting portraits of animal, which is one of the great advantages of now having animal eye AF. And we can see as we zoom in post-production software how much detail we have around that eye of this kangaroo here. And again, a monkey in barley, zooming in to actual pixels or 100% magnification, we can see how rich and sharp the eyes are on this baby monkey here. Now, I did say earlier that it has dual AF linear motors, and this really helps the lens perform when we're shooting action that is unfolding really quickly, and we're working still with the maximum aperture, so the AF has to be really precise. Now, this long border is screeching to a halt on the right here, basically only just stopping in time, and the whole sequence of shots as it approached me at near 70 kilometers per hour were all pin sharp. Just because it's called a portrait prime, it doesn't mean that we can only photograph portraits with this lens. It does lend itself to landscapes, as I'm showcasing here. One of the advantages of having that maximum f1.8 aperture is we can often find ourselves working at the first and last light of day handheld if we choose, or if you want to smooth the water, you can of course put the camera on a tripod, stop down to f8, and the lens will still deliver when stopped down. I'm a photographer that prefers to work with prime lenses rather than zoom lenses, and but if I was only going to own one of these prime lenses, it would be the 85mm f1.8. Now, these are currently my favorite for prime lenses, and you'd really have to pry them from my cold dead hands. I am so attached to working with these four lenses here. Now, often I'll work with just two of the primes in a messenger bag with two bodies, and I'll show you how I can work with an ultra wide angle lens such as the 20mm and the 85mm. Now, the 20mm will basically, in a forest situation such as this, cover everything that is in front of me, the forest floor. But the 85mm is an essential tool for me because I like to isolate subjects within the forest. So for instance, those three central images are using that shallow depth of field in order to isolate something in this busy forest environment. And this spider that I've captured here showcases how I can actually isolate the web against that busy background there. Now, the closest focusing distance of this lens is only 80 centimeters, or around just over 2.5 feet. But I can crop a little bit closer if I need to get closer to that subject. And this is especially one of the advantages of working with our high resolution sensors these days. If we do find that we're working at the closest focusing distance, but we want to get closer still, we can shoot in APS-C mode, cropping in camera, or just crop in post-production. Now, I haven't always owned this lens, of course, and now I've had a long career in photography, but I've always been attached to working with that 85mm prime. So in a previous life, I actually worked with Nikon cameras before I became a Sony ambassador and Sony photographer, but still I was attached to working with the 85mm prime. Here's a Nikkor 85mm 1.8. And if I just zoom in on one of those images, it clearly shows why I think this is an important lens for my own workflows. It gives that figure ground separation, gives that background blur or bokeh that is so important for creating narrative, where you want to draw the viewer's attention to a specific point in the image, as in this case in Paris, working with this guy reading his newspaper. Now, the first E-mount 85mm prime wasn't the FE 85mm 1.8, it was the Zeiss Batis 1.8 85mm, and this was a lens that is absolutely fabulous. There's no bones about it. This is also an excellent 85mm prime, and so I have some of my all-time favorite images captured with this Zeiss Batis lens, and you can see here that beautiful shallow depth of field. And this was predating animal IF. I would particularly use DMF in these instances to get sharp focus on an animal's eyes. And of course, having that f1.8 aperture, if we were working in exceptionally low ambient light, we do have that f1.8 aperture to make sure the ISO is as low as possible. Here I'm still shooting at 12,800 ISO. Now that would have gone through the ceiling if I was shooting with a zoom lens that didn't have that ultra wide aperture. And of course that figure ground separation, taking the that prime lens as one of several lenses I took to Alaska, giving me the opportunity to shoot those portraits. Here this is an image of Brenda, who's protecting me from the grizzly bears and in Alaska as we go hunting bears, if you like, not with the gun but with our cameras. And of course, as I said, we don't have to shoot portraits with this lens. It is equally adept at shooting landscapes. Here I'm shooting the landscape with the 85mm Batis, increasing the shutter speed because I'm now moving on a quickly moving boat, and so having that a wide aperture, fast shutter speed allows me to capture this beautiful landscape on the Inside Passage in Alaska. And of course, this is one of my favorite all-time monkey shots taken with that Batis lens. Now I will point you to the bokeh balls in the background. They are a slightly hexagonal shape here, and that is probably one of the small disadvantages of this Zeiss Batis lens here, is if we don't shoot wide open, we have square-sided blades to this aperture ring, and you will get these hexagonal bokeh balls when you're working with the Zeiss. So if you were buying the Zeiss Batis, I would probably recommend that you shoot wide open for the smoothest possible bokeh. Now the only other flaw that I found with that Zeiss Batis lens, it's got a small amount of color fringing when used wide open. That is common for a lot of ultra wide aperture lenses, so I won't actually point that as a negative, and it is quite easily fixed in post-production just by getting that defringe eyedropper and clicking on any green or purple fringing that you might see. It typically appears against a very bright highlight against one of the sharp edges that is often a little bit darker. So again, let's point back to some of the great things about the FE 85, Sony's 85, and it really comes down to some of the advantages is a rounded 9-blade diaphragm. That means if we do stop the aperture down just to get a little bit more depth of field, the bokeh balls will stay around in the center of the image. We also have over and above the Batis lens, we do have an AF/MF switch on the barrel of the lens itself, and also that focus hold button, which I'll often reassign to IAF. And of course the Batis lens is a completely smooth button-free barrel, so I think we do have a slight advantage with that Sony lens. And perhaps the most obvious advantage is the price point. $1,249 on B&H Photo for the Batis 85 and $548 for the Sony. And I'd have to say the Sony is as sharp as that Batis. The Batis is a really sharp lens, but the Sony comes in my reckoning just as sharp, so you don't lose any of that performance by choosing the cheaper lens. So let's take a look at some of portraits that I've captured with Sony's FE 85mm f1.8, and in post-production I'll just magnify these to 100% so you can quite clearly see this is equally the match for that Batis lens. This is a picture of a boy that I took in Bali, and again you can see beautiful shallow depth of field, beautiful sharpness from this lens. This one was one of my more recent images captured this year in a dark forest of the indigenous guide taking us through, and again pin sharp eye there. And again, if you're photographing the monkeys rather than the people, we're still going to be blessed with very rich detail. Always pleasing to be able to zoom in with this 85mm prime and just marvel at the detail we've been capturing. And so it is a portrait lens, and and because of that quick AF, I can use it in street portraiture where people only just become aware that I'm standing right next to them taking their picture. I will always drop the camera immediately if they notice that I'm taking pictures, and then engage them in conversation with a big smile to make sure that they're relaxed, and then I'll often go in for a second camera aware portrait after that as well. This was in Bali again. He's very relaxed in front of the camera, and again beautiful shallow depth of field, beautiful sharpness on these portraits. I used this lens last year to capture my father at 90, and I put this as a triptych image with his early days in the Navy and him as a younger boy, and I thought this made a beautiful triptych of him going through the ages. Okay, so we'll take a look at just a few more portraits, but you're probably already convinced that this is a very sharp lens and can be used pretty much wide open all of the time. I really like that shallow depth of field. Some people may want to stop down a little bit just to make sure or ensure the nose and the eyebrows are as sharp as the eyes, but I am drawn in by this very shallow depth of field. It also has the effect of removing any distracting elements that might be in the background as well. And again, a very recent portrait that I took this year. It's the lens that I very rarely, if ever, leave at home because it is such an essential tool for what I'm doing. This is a photograph just taken by a street light at night of a kabuki actor outside a theatre in Japan. And he was quite willing just to have several portraits, just using the harsh light in that background. But again, wide open, probably very elevated ISOs. But again, this is the advantage of having that f1.8 aperture when working handheld. When I'm going for the 3/4 length or full length portraits in the street as well, and this time in the river, we can see that again that very shallow depth of field that this lens affords us does give us that figure ground separation. The person in this isn't going to blend into the background because both are equally sharp. We get that separation by using this lens. This time I'm showcasing not background blur but foreground blur. I purposely put myself in front of the corner of a building with some graffiti, and it's going to be well out of focus as I focus on a building in the distance there. So I really like this building up depth in the image using shallow depth of field and shallow focus. Here I'm just isolating something, and we're going to look at the way that I love to isolate things. I'll often shoot the broader environment with a wide angle lens and then go in and isolate details within that landscape shot. Now I've used this for a lot of wildlife photography as well. This was a bowerbird in a tropical rainforest here, and I'm just isolating the bird. There's a lot of busy foreground, a lot of busy background in this forest, but that very shallow depth of field isolates his bower and the bird, and he's just rearranging his bower to try and attract a female. And he also collects very bright blue objects that he'll put in front of his bower to attract the female before he does his dance. And here is I shot this on a previous year with the Batis lens, and now I'm back shooting this family of monkeys with the newer Sony lens. It did come out in early 2017, and again these very humorous shots of these just the family goings on in Bali. And it does allow me to again isolate detail. Here I'm going in and moving to the closest focusing distance of the lens now, just to isolate some of the grooming here. Now I would have gone even closer, but of course there is that minimum focusing distance. So what I would do is, in order to get as tight a crop as possible, I would just then go in and just crop a little bit more in post-production, or again you could crop in camera using APS-C mode. And here is a family of those monkeys captured with the 1.885. Now I will be stopping down perhaps to f5.6 or beyond in order to get all three three of the monkeys in sharp focus. If you are working at very close range, that 1.8 aperture is only going to focus on one of the three monkeys, so you will stop down smaller than f5.6 to get all three of these monkeys in sharp focus. But again, most of the time I am working at that maximum aperture here, just isolating the eye on this cassowary. Now there is color fringing on this lens, used wide open. You'll pretty much know where it will sit once you realize that if you're looking at a very bright part of the image that is adjacent to a dark part of the image, that's where you're going to find the purple and the green color fringing. But as I said, you would just go in post-production, that's in Lightroom CC or Lightroom Classic, just go to that defringe eyedropper, take the eyedropper up to that color fringing and click on it. Now this is the color fringing is different from the chromatic aberration that would typically be found in the corners of your images, that is fixed automatically just by enabling the lens corrections. This is something that has to be removed manually. But as I said, most ultra wide aperture lenses do have this color fringing. There are a few that don't or have very minimal color fringing, but the 85 is not one of those lenses. So here's a before and after. See that very bright wall just right on the edge of clipping. Again, you put that up against a dark edge, you're pretty much guaranteed that purple and green fringing. As I said, many ultra wide aperture lenses do have this color fringing, and it is present on the 85 f1.4 G Master as well. So just spending more than twice as much on a lens isn't necessarily going to get rid of that color fringing. One of the few primes that I have that doesn't have color fringing is that 135 G Master. Here it is again on a very bright edge that I'm shooting with the 85mm G Master lens there. Now I've shown you all of the images so far captured with the 85mm lens on a full frame sensor, but it is by far and away my favorite lens on a crop sensor, an APS-C. This is one of the advantages of Sony's one mount system, where we can take lenses across formats into the smaller APS-C format or over to their professional cine lenses. Basically any mirrorless camera, these lenses will move between those three systems. So this lens, when placed on an APS-C camera such as the Alpha 6400 or 6600, 6100, A6000 even, it starts behaving as if it's a 135 2.8. Obviously the angle of view is going to be narrow when put on an APS-C camera, so it pretty much matches the depth of field and angle of view of that 135 Zeiss. Now that Zeiss 135 2.8 is $1,700. Now you'd get the camera and the lens, the 85mm prime and the camera, and still have change by moving into the APS-C format to get what I'm about to show you. So this image, the lead image of this video tutorial, was actually captured with the Alpha 6400 camera. Now you are going to be quite close up and personal shooting because obviously the subjects are going to appear much closer with that angle of narrower angle of view. But for some people who perhaps are a little bit timid of photographing complete strangers, this may be a better option than an 85 is shooting with maybe a full frame camera in APS-C mode or putting it on an APS-C camera. So when I'm going around, I pretty much use this as my street lens of choice on the Alpha 6400 when I spent a few months touring Japan. And I got these series of very beautiful portraits, candid portraits. Often the sitters are unaware that I'm working because with that narrow angle of view, I'm just a little bit further away from the subject. So if the subject is slightly distracted by looking at something or engaged in a particular activity, they're often not aware that I'm actually taking photographs of them. Again, if they do notice the camera, I'll immediately lower the camera and greet them with a big smile. So here I am just waiting for a train. As you're probably aware, the Japanese trains have a reputation for always leaving on time. So this guy is basically checking that the train is arriving exactly when it should arrive, and indeed it did. And this is a young woman photographing, and again I'm photographing her because she's slightly distracted. She's not going to notice me if she's busy taking photographs. And here someone at a temple just waving the smoke towards them, again just captured with that beautiful figure ground separation so that background doesn't become a distraction. I had the opportunity to go and photograph some sumo wrestlers in training here. The ambient light was very low and I wasn't allowed to use flash, not that I would anyway. So here I am with the 85mm on the Alpha 6400, shooting at ISO 2500 here, but getting these beautiful shots of the sumo wrestlers, both rest and also quite active. And here I am working in Hiroshima, trying to isolate that character in the extreme bottom right hand corner. I also want to isolate the bamboo pole which will ring the peace bell in Hiroshima, so I don't want to lose any of that detail because the background is too sharp. So again, that 85mm focal length f1.8 is going to do the trick pretty much every time. I will take a crop sensor camera with that 85mm prime and shoot portraits and demonstrations. Here I'm at Pride Parade, shooting all of the characters. Very few of the characters are actually stationary, so they're very fast AF. The dual linear AF motors is going to come into play here. Typically these people will be walking towards me, I'll be walking backwards, just capturing images at maybe 8 frames per second, and the camera and the IAF is pretty much going to deliver almost every time. This guy was actually a hip-hop dancer and he's very active, and I had a whole sequence of shots, and I actually showcased how the new AF algorithms that arrived in 2019 were pretty much extremely sticky, and of course the 85mm was delivering because it could keep up with the new fast focusing cameras. And again, coming in for that close portrait, the leading eye pin sharp, and the eyes and the eyelashes of these young girls really sharp, and again just so sharp. A lot of people would say, well, why would you put a full frame lens on an APS-C camera? Why wouldn't you just buy an APS-C lens? Well, there isn't actually an 85mm prime that Sony make for this format, so it's ideal to go on to this camera. And of course it's not a huge lens, so it doesn't look out of place on those smaller APS-C cameras. It's also my favorite lens on the Full-Frame A7C, a very small compact form factor there. And if we zoom in on any of these images, you're going just to be always rewarded. It's no less sharp because it's put on an APS-C camera. There was somebody who did a review saying it was nearly always a bad idea to put a full frame lens on a crop sensor camera, but if you were to look at the ultra high definition images that I'm going to post, that doesn't ring true. This lens is pin sharp wide open, as is the 35mm f1.8 lens on the APS-C camera. Okay, so here I'm going to showcase how I will shoot the broader environment, maybe with a standard focal length or a wide angle focal length, and then I will isolate. That isolation through depth of field is something that I love to do, and there is those beautiful round bokeh balls in the center of the image there. I will often find myself putting myself at a 45-degree angle to something that recedes into the distance, and then just isolate one of many, and this is a great way of just drawing the viewer's attention to a specific point in the image. And I will do this often, and I basically got hundreds of these shots where in Japan I was just isolating details within the broader environment. I think it's really a great way of building up a richer narrative when you're trying to create a story of where you've been. So for instance, here are the Torii gates, and yes, this would be shot with a wide angle lens, but then I would go in and isolate small details that I want the viewer to pay attention to. Okay, so this would be some of the Japanese lettering in the broader scene, and again that shallow depth of field does a fine job. Here I'm in a Japanese garden in the blossom season, but again after shooting the broader environment to say this is where I am, going in and isolating those details. So I'll often find that I'm shooting 4 times as many images with the 85 and just creating that establishing shot with the wide angle, and then getting these beautiful details with the 85mm. And of course, because it does lend itself to shooting portraits, getting portraits in amongst the blossom as well, a very popular season for the Japanese to go out and take photographs of the blossom on the trees. And so I would be standing one tree away taking pictures of them, taking pictures of the blossom. And here is a bamboo forest, again captured with a wide angle lens, and then going in with that 85mm and isolating just one piece of bamboo in amongst the forest of bamboo. Okay, so hopefully you've probably realized that this is one of my favorite lenses, and because of that price point, when it first came out, I created a blog post. I didn't review it, I just created a blog post and I said it was my lens of the year. It wasn't a G, it wasn't a GM, it wasn't Zeiss design, but it was certainly Sony's best value for money lens. Okay, so if you've enjoyed the information, just give me the thumbs up, subscribe, head over to patreon.com/Mark Gaylor if you want to download camera specific ebooks. I have a lot of 500-page ebooks for all of the latest Sony cameras, and I do have active Q&A forums to answer all of your questions, and I deliver member only 1-hour seminars. Okay, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.